Okay, there is a story that the Mahabharata is actually only an adaptation of Homer's epic, the Iliad, which was brought to, India, close to India, by the Indo-Greeks. That is to say, the Indo-Greek or the Greek settlement on the borders of India in the northwest frontier province in Afghanistan. Oh, yes, these are they. So you can see there in the northwestern corner, there were a few kingdoms, but so culturally they were one. They were Greek, and they tried to maintain their Greek culture. Did everything like in Greece, built temples like Greek, sculptures like Greek, and so on. In fact, they came there a bit earlier than Alexander, because the Persians in their empire had a policy of resettling Greeks in backward areas, because they expected the Greeks to develop them and so on. But the main Greek settlement was after Alexander, who married an Afghan woman, Roxanne. So there was quite a bit of coexistence between those two, and so there was a strong Greek imprint to the extent that modern tribes in that area cultivate the idea that they are the descendants of Alexander's troops. There is in fact even in Greece an office of the Greek church devoted to converting the so-called Greeks in Pakistan and Afghanistan. There is also a nationalist party that doesn't want any non-Mediterraneans to inhabit Greece. So Nordics like me are not welcome. Blacks and so on are also not welcome. But welcome are Pakistanis and Afghans, because they might be descendants of those Indo-Greeks. Well, so this story is not typical for some Eurocentric obsession of the Europeans, because on the contrary, all those Orientalists who are all the time by Edward Said and all his followers accused of being agents of European imperialism and so on, they were all attached to the Indianness of the Mahabharata. They never came to the idea that this was borrowed from the Greeks, for a number of reasons. I skipped the less important things in the interest of time. But one example, Michael Witzel from Harvard, who is very prominent in the Aryan debate, he claims that the Mahabharata is in fact a replay or an elaboration of the Vedic battle of the 10 kings. Now, if you study that is quite groundless. The stories of the battle are completely different, the contexts are different, and so on. I see absolutely no ground for connecting them. Nevertheless, the important thing is that he bases the Mahabharata on an Indian experience, namely the Battle of the 10 Kings. So nothing from outside. Now, what does this thesis by Fernando Wolf Alonso then say? You see, he notes an important similarity between the Greek Iliad and the Mahabharata, namely both of them are about a massacre of the heroes. And so in both stories it is not only the losers who get massacred, the winners also, somewhat regret their victory. Either they die in war, or they even die after obtaining victory. That's what happens to all the Pandava men who die under Ashwatthama at the end or after the battle, or they suffer misery upon homecoming, like in the Iliad. King Agamemnon goes home and then is murdered by his wife and her lover. And here too we have, for example, Krishna and the Vrishnis who massacre one another after coming home safely in Dwarka. So, I have the impression that one slide has been skipped anyway, so I repeat the name of the author of this. Fernando Wolf Alonso. So he's Spanish professor in Malaga, and he came out with his thesis, I think in Spanish 2004. There is an English version from Motilal from 2014. Yeah, clearly there is one skipped, because that's where I explain, but I'll explain it anyway. The reason why this massacre takes place in the Iliad. And it is explained in the Iliad itself and in the comment literature that the ancient Greeks already had. Namely, the earth is complaining that she is being tortured by this heavy burden of fighters who inhabit her. You see, nowadays you have the so-called deep ecology, which means the idea that mankind is nothing better and nothing more special than all the rest of nature, and in fact is some kind of vermin on the skin of Mother Earth. So Mother Earth in those days already thought so. And so she wanted to get rid of them, and so Zeus, the main god, who is the Greek equivalent of Indra, decides, well, yes, okay, I'll liberate you from the heroes, I'll make sure they die. And so he implants all kinds of passions in all kinds of people so that they end up killing each other. Now, does the same thing count for the Mahabharata? And Vyasa actually explains the reasons. After the war, he explains to the widows why all this has happened. And so one thing that totally is absent in the Greek version is reincarnation. He says, well, you see, each of these men had their own story, and you see, because of anything in their last incarnations, they had to do this. Then a second one is, well, in the larger perspective, all this is not so bad, because they were killing each other, they hated each other, and now that they're all dead, now they are reconciled in heaven. And then finally, the idea that this is necessary for the end of an age. And this happens at every age, like the last one, it was with Parashuram, who also committed a great massacre. And so that was necessary to end the Treta Yuga, the Dwapara Yuga, now the Dwapara Yuga. And even though the next age is even worse than the age that they are living in, because the Kali Yuga is reputed to be the worst, nevertheless this is necessary to come to the next Krita Yuga. So even though it is a bit miserable, it's also part of a greater plan that ultimately is for the good. So that is a sort of positive reading that is absent in the Greek version. It's not just tragedy. Another big difference is that, and that's not said by Vyasa, but you can't miss it if you read it, quite a few of the unfortunate things that happen are due to a curse. Like Gandhari curses Krishna, saying, you could have prevented this, it is you who are responsible for all this killing, therefore I curse you. And so that ends with the unfortunate intra-killing of the Vrishni tribe and the rather miserable, not so glorious death of Krishna himself. In the Greek version, the really important factor is that if men displease the gods, if men overrule the gods, if men are too proud and thereby insult the gods, then they bring misfortune upon themselves. This is called hubris. And apart from that, you see, that is one factor. Nevertheless, whatever you do, no matter how much good you do, the gods may still be playing with you. And so that whimsicality is absent from the Indian version. In the Indian version, everything really has a reason. And people bring misfortune upon themselves, both the good guys and the bad guys. You see, the Iliad to some extent, but the Mahabharata certainly is not a children's fairy tale. You see, it's not black and white. All the good guys also have something bad to answer for, and vice versa. Like you see, the Pandavas treat Karna miserably, but he is treated very well by Duryodhana. So don't blame Duryodhana for everything. Okay, so, but you see, all in all, I mean, it's a very big thing. You can't easily make a sweeping judgment, but all in all, I think that the Mahabharata is a bit more rational. Oh my God, what is this? I'd like to go to the earlier page, but I don't know how to do that. Any computer wizard in here? No? Well, okay, anyway, then I'll say my thing just like that. Another big difference is that there is a strong spiritual content in the Mahabharata, which is not there in the Iliad, except in the general vague sense that, well, you shouldn't insult the gods. You know, the gods are part of your world and you should be careful. Whereas there is a strong yogic element in the Mahabharata. Now, overall, I think that Alonso's thesis cannot be defended because the differences between the two epics are too big. We'll come to some details about that. But you see, the contents of the two are just different, but you can still explain that perhaps by the fact that the Indians just happen to have a different perspective, which they infused in the narrative while in the process of taking it over from the Greeks. You might argue like that. Then the theme of the conflict is also very different. It's not what you would expect if it is taken over. You see, in the Iliad, you have the honor of soldiers at stake and not much else. It is the men's world, it is a battlefield, men are fighting. Women are the cause of the whole battle, at least ostensibly, because they too are manipulated by Zeus. Ultimately, it's Zeus who has this all in hand. Zeus and the other gods, but the other gods also don't know what they're doing. But they have these passions, they are partisan. There are gods on the Trojan side, gods on the Greek side. But they too are manipulated just like the human beings by Zeus, ultimately. But so in the Indian version, women take a key role all the time. And that's the difference. Then you see this notion of dharma is all pervading. It's hardly there in the Greek version. But again, you could say with Alonso, yeah, well, after all, it is an Indian adaptation. So if there are Indian elements, well, maybe that doesn't disprove that it was of Greek origin. So we'll address a few harder facts that are more difficult to negotiate with. It is the chronological markers in the text. Both texts describe a chariot war, and the high tide of chariot warfare was the second half of the second millennium BC. After that, it went out of fashion. It was too dangerous in the sense that if anything happened to your chariot, you were lost. You know, with a horse, you are relatively safer. And so with the stirrup being developed, you see people learned stability on a horse so that they could wield their weapons. And so that was better than a chariot. But chariots remained in vogue, but purely as playthings, like the gladiator games in the Roman Empire. So people knew about chariots, but it was something for old history. And in this respect, both stories are the same. They are written out in an age when chariots are no longer used, about a war that took place in chariot days, and in fact chariot warfare is totally central to the story. You know, there are many interpolations in the Mahabharata from later days, but that it is chariot warfare that's so completely central, that cannot be interpolated. So either they didn't have anything for inspiration in India and had to take it from the Greeks, or it is likely that this also existed in India. And I mean, chariot warfare existed. You see, the first chariot has been, the oldest has now been found in India a few months ago only, in Sanauli, I think, somewhere in the eastern part of the Indus civilization. And so we know that, you see, chariots were all over the place in India. They were very much part of life. Now, there are markers that suggest that the Mahabharata is late, but that only means that the final editing is late. You see, for 1,000 years they kept on writing and expanding the Mahabharata. So we find, for example, mentioned several times of a people called the Chinas, which is the Chinese. Now there you have a very clear chronological marker, because the name China refers to a specific emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who lived about 230 BC. So we know that this was written later than 230 BC, at least the end of it. Very sure. Also the Yavanas are mentioned, of course. So that could plead in favor of Alonso's thesis. However, when you look at other chronological markers, clearly they plead against it, and very definitively. I'll mention the main one. Bhishma's death takes place about 7 days or a bit more, but at least 7 days after the solstice. This plays a big role in the story, when he's lying on his bed of arrows. And we know when this took place because of the precession movement. You see, so many degrees after the solstice corresponds to a motion of so many times 71 years in real life. So the two zodiacs move vis-a-vis one another at the rate of 71 years per degree, or 1 degree per 71 years, that's it. And so we know that when that particular star, Regulus or Magha, mentioned by Bhishma, when that passed the solstice, it was 2300 BC. Now 7 years later corresponds to about 1800, 1700 BC. That or the next few centuries must be when the Mahabharata war took place historically, which is very much before the Indo-Greeks. Incidentally, this is also a proof why the Vedas must predate these 2300 BC, because that particular stellar position is also mentioned in the Kaushitaki Brahmana, which is a pretty late text compared to the Rig Veda. So the Rig Veda is like 3000 BC. Okay, now where is it? Let's hope we do it right this time. No, we don't do it right because we miss one photograph. But it's not at all an interesting photograph, it's just a face. Namely, Georges Dumézil was a European scholar, died 35 years ago, and who is being attacked by Alonso. You see, his thesis is that there are very many related stories throughout all the Indo-European mythologies, hence also Greek and Indian, that go back to the common Indo-European period 3,000-4,000 BC. Like, for example, the story of the dragon slayer. It is there in all mythologies: Indra killing Vrtra, Zeus slaying Typhon. You have several versions among the Germanic people and so on. And you even have them outside the Indo-European world, like in Turkish and in Akkadian, in the Gilgamesh epos. You find another case of dragon slaying. Or, for instance, the story of the creation of the world by the twins, called Mano and Yemo. Manu and Yama. Manu means man, Yemo means twin brother. And the story is this, that man kills twin and uses his body parts to create heaven. his skull to make the heavenly vault, his feet to make the earth, and so on. A very important story on which is based the doctrine of corporatism, the idea that the world and also society is a mirror image of the human body. And this you find famously in the Purusha Sukta. But rather than blaming these poor Hindus for writing an ugly, vicious, anti-egalitarian Purusha Sukta, I'd like to point out that the same view of the world is present among the Romans, even among the Catholics. Saint Paul gives the same story. You find it in China and so on. It's a very common theme. Anyway, so this word twin in some languages comes to mean mortal or even death. Yama, the god of death, ultimately goes back to this myth of the twin being killed. Okay, so that's a common theme, not pertaining to the two epics, just to give you the idea. Now I'm going to mention one from the epics. The thunder god, Indra or Zeus, has the power of taking a different shape. And he uses that. For instance, to seduce a desired woman, Indra impersonates Gautama to seduce the latter's wife Ahalya, which then comes back in the Ramayana story. Zeus takes other forms all the time to seduce all kinds of women. But then, outside these two branches, we find in the Germanic branch a similar story. So this has nothing to do with the Indo-Greeks transmitting it to India. It's much older. And in fact, this doctrine is the basis of the Maya doctrine, which is also the consciousness taking the shape of nature, of the world. Now, one of these shape changes is that he takes the form of a woman. And, in all these myths, he often has to do this, or this happens to him. Like in Germany, Thor has to reconquer his own weapon, the lightning, the Vajra, by dressing up as a woman, so that he can get in where it is hidden. The same thing is done in the Trojan War by Odysseus, who infiltrates Troy by dressing as a woman. Then you have a very similar story in the Mahabharata, where Arjuna hides himself by dressing not exactly as a woman, eunuch in the case, but dressing as a woman, teaching a woman's art, namely dancing. So this is a very common theme, but much older than Alexander the Great. Okay, now Nick Allen is one of these people following Dumézil. He is emphasizing that the different branches of Indo-European go back much farther, about 6,000 years, and have a lot in common. Like, for example, the idea of trifunctionaliteit, trifunctionality, which means what you know in India as the triguna. You find many myths who have this sovereign priestly function, color white. You see a martial function, color red, and a productive function, color black. That this is a theme that regularly reappears. That's from Dumézil. Nick Allen has greatly worked on it. Now the important story here, and I'll sort of wind up with that, is his thesis, The Indo-European Roots of Yoga. Aha. Now that is really, really an important revolutionary one. In my opinion, it's also proof that the homeland of an European was India and not Europe, but I won't hold him responsible for that. That's what I deduce from it. But then he gives examples. For example, in the Mahabharata, you have a story of a journey by Arjuna to the Himalaya and thence to Indra's heavenly city, where he collects some divine weapons. And you have one, not in the Iliad, but in the sequence to it, the Odyssey, also by Homer, where Odysseus makes a journey from one island to another, the blissful island of Scheria, where he also acquires magical technology, namely a ship that brings him home, which is what he's after all these years. Finally he can get there, because they have a special ship, a ship that is not subject to the wiles of the sea god Poseidon, and which has the unique property of being self-guided. It's self-propelled, it doesn't need rowers, it doesn't need sails, and it is self-guided. You see, just by thinking I have to go this direction, automatically the ship goes in that direction. This is futuristic technology. There are many similarities between the two stories. For instance, both leave not of their own initiative, but because they are told by respectively Vyasa and Hermes. They both leave a loving woman behind who hopes to marry him, but you see he decides differently, and so on. However, no matter how similar the two stories are, and maybe they could have been used by Alonso to emphasize the similarity, in fact, Indra's journey has a strong yogic dimension, which in Odysseus is missing. It's also said explicitly in the story, he's yoked to Indra's yoga. Anyway, forget about the pictures, listen to my story. Now, again, you can bring in a third pole, non-Greek, non-Indian, where you also see this yogic element, or at least a memory of it. You all know about Shiva. Shiva is depicted with the third eye and with the trident or trishul. Okay. Now, Shiva appears in different mythologies outside India. It is Shiva who is the ideal yogi. So if you put yourself to the test, you see, if you harden yourself, if you practice tapas, a figurative way of speaking is that it is Shiva who puts you to the test. Why? Because Shiva is like the future yogi that you yourself aspire to become. So Arjuna is put to the test by Shiva, but it effectively means he himself is subjecting himself to yogic exercises. By contrast, when Odysseus has trouble with Poseidon, there's nothing he does himself. He's only tortured by Poseidon, who has decided to hate him. Now this Poseidon, like Shiva, he has a trident. He is not depicted with a third eye. However, his son Polyphemus, and very often the son has the same properties as the father, just like Arjuna with Indra, he has one eye. Aha. Now that being one-eyed is simply the version that people who do not have the understanding of yoga anymore finally make of this memory of a third eye that they don't understand anymore. The same thing you have with the Germanic god Woden or Odin. He is depicted as spending 9 nights as hanging from a tree. Now this hanging from a tree is a typical and in fact practically the oldest described yoga exercise. There on the picture you see an Indian painting of a yogi hanging from a tree. So he's looking for knowledge. It's more or less what a yogi does. He does not have a trident, however he has another symbol that's also of tree, this 3 knotted triangles. And he also is one-eyed, and he has become one-eyed simply as the price to pay for knowledge. You see, he aspires to consciousness, to yoga, and so he has a third eye, which later, when they forget about yoga, in all their wanderings from India all the way to Scandinavia, then they imagine, you see, this is one eye, and he has lost one eye. Okay? So it's the same thing in the Greek story, in the Scandinavian story, but ultimately this all goes back to an Indian knowledge that you find depicted in the Mahabharata. And it's not exclusive to the Mahabharata, but it is in the Mahabharata. So conclusion, It is of course not impossible that the Indo-Greeks contributed certain details to the Mahabharata. And there are indeed some details that are very similar, that are practically impossible not to have borrowed. But the overall epics contains too many other elements, both the overall perspective and then a number of specific images that are used in there. Sometimes they are from older history, like the astronomical thing I mentioned, but mostly they are from common Indo-European origins. So, my final word on the Mahabharata, and on the much discussed question of its historicity, what you have is a common literary framework of which you find numerous traces in both the Greek epics and the Indian epics, and to a lesser extent bits and pieces here in shorter stories among the Germans and among many others, the Romans and so on. So you have this literary framework, and then you have a historical event. The war in Troy for the Greeks, the war in Kurukshetra for the Indians, and then in the retelling of the story of the events that really happened, more and more of this literary framework is introduced. And at the end, when the story is complete, you see far more of the literary framework than of the historical events. The historical events make up only a small part of the Mahabharata, and all the rest has been added. But that doesn't mean that it has been invented, it is just literary fantasy or something. No, it goes back to this ancient literary framework that you find all over the Indo-European world. Thank you.
Inaugural session, it was too late. In the first session, we are just continuing, but we have 3 speakers, but we can accommodate in this session because it is about 2. So after the lunch, next speaker for the first session, Sarkar Mustafa, will continue. Thank you all. But now I request you all go for the lunch. Okay? Thank you.
Esteemed